Deep Dive Book Club podcast. I'm Joel.
I'm Leo, and for anyone just tuning in, this podcast is centered on having long format discussions about books we have read or books that we're in the process of reading. We dive into both fiction and nonfiction books. The only thing better than reading a good book is having great discussions about it, and we want to include you in the conversation.
And so, ti prego, I plead to you, if you would like to reach out to us, you can do it at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com, sending us an email, going to our Patreon /deepdivebookclub, X at deepdivebc, that's Bravo Charlie, Instagram /deepdivebookclub, or YouTube at deepdivebookpod. Any of those places, go there, message us. We'd love to read your comments on air and connect with you.
Today, we are happily going to be discussing a fun book called The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt.
I appreciate your pun there. We are going to dive deep into the happiness hypothesis. I'm really excited. This was a great book that we got to read. Very fun. Jonathan Haidt was a great author to read, and he is pretty good at putting stuff together.
He did a really good job of synthesizing a lot of large ideas into very digestible, thought-provoking format.
And you know me, I love a good academic that has the parlance to give it to the general audience. So, Leo, would you like to tell me more about Jonathan?
Jonathan Haidt was born October 19th, 1963. He's an American social psychologist and author. He has worked in the social and moral psychology field, and his research interests include moral psychology, political psychology, positive psychology, and business ethics. He's written several popular books for general audiences that stem from his academic research work and studies that he's conducted himself. His major research focus has spanned moral disgust, moral elevation, social intuitionism, and moral foundations theory, all of which we'll just kind of, by the by, going through the book, we'll be discussing in greater and smaller detail. He's also known for the elephant and rider metaphor, which we'll also be talking about a lot in our episodes on this book, and this is related to his work on social intuitionism. This metaphor, coincidentally, was picked up by another author we read, Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. The metaphor roughly refers to what Kahneman calls System 1 and System 2 for automatic and controlled processes within the mind. Jonathan Haidt uses it a little bit more to indicate the difference between our intuitive, quick way of thinking, or the elephant is the intuitive, quick way of thinking, and the rational rider who thinks he's in control is our ability to rationalize things and think through things logically, which has the illusory effect of seeming like the rider's in control when it's really the elephant.
Go ahead. I thought that was a great connection from getting books that we've already read to circle back around. That's my favorite part about a continuing book club, is we get to have a overlap and connection, and we kind of keep going in this circle of getting to learn more. All right,
Joel, you want to list off the books that he's written?
I do want to list those off because as we were reading through his bibliography, even the titles themselves sounded so great, and I'd read more of his works because of his good work here. For example, he wrote The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Another one, The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And finally, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. I think that these titles give the highlight of how he writes very impactful topics that really align with some of the high-impact evolving ideas that surround our generation and the introduction of modern technology, research, and everything else.
I've listened to several podcast interviews of Jonathan Haidt. He's unsurprisingly a very good communicator, both verbally and in writing, and he is passionate about these topics. Specifically, I've heard interviews for Anxious Generation and Coddling on the American Mind, and the stuff he talks about is very fascinating, very timely, and is very engaging. So no surprise there, and the happiness hypothesis is the only thing I've read of his so far, but like you, I would happily read more.
Yeah, and I think he really gets into the research of key elements of our modern society. And how do you not have this question, right? I think we have just hanging out talked about mental illness and the development of changing psychology about how to raise children, that is a big important thing. And we are the most therapized group of people in history. And how is that changing the landscape of our psyche and how we're approaching mental health? All of these are great questions we don't have answers to, and I would love to dive deeper into those.
Right. Okay, so let's start with an overview of the content of the book, and then we will jump in to our usual deep dive of looking at more in-depth topic. All right, Joel, let's go through the overview here. So, the main thrust of this book is, as you might expect, the idea of comparing ancient wisdom about what brings happiness and life satisfaction with modern psychology and findings from modern science. He does a beautiful job of pairing these two together in a very thoughtful approach and very well structured. There's a few key ideas that stand out, and he's bringing out current topics or then current topics in academic circles. So let's look at these initial principles first and then go from there. Let's talk about first the divided self.
So the divided self, and I do think it's a great idea to get into these like overarching topics, and then if you would like, we can go a little bit chapter by chapter. The divided self. Haidt's central metaphor is that the mind is like a rider, when we were talking about the rider and the elephant, and that's the conscious reasoning on top of the elephant, or the emotional intuitive processing. The rider can guide the elephant, but the elephant's impulses are far stronger, meaning we're not as in control as we think we are.
Right. We feel a cohesive stream of consciousness. We feel like our lived experiences is one thing, but what is our self is both the rider and the elephant. And we feel like we also identify with the rider. We feel like that is us. The logical reasoning A to B part of our minds we feel like is us, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, or the rider on top of the elephant.
Right. And those impulses are pretty strong. And in some ways, as some in-person book club friends mentioned, they feel a little fearful or scared at the fact that they're not really themselves, right? Because the rational part of the brain is only a portion, in many arguments, the smaller portion of who we truly are.
Right. That is a scary thought, to think about the majority of who you are is not what you consciously feel and identify with.
The second principle that Haidt really brings up here is the adaptation principle. We adapt to almost everything, good and bad. Lottery winners and paraplegics return to roughly the same happiness baseline after major life events, which means external circumstances matter far less than what we originally expected.
Right. As living organisms, as long as we are alive, we are essentially that which adapts. Adaptation is simply what we do.
In many regards, from a biological evolutionary standpoint, we're one of the best animals that we know of at adaptation. Very few animals are able to adapt to the amount of ecosystems that we have adapted to.
For some reason, that makes me think of the fun pseudo-theory of the aquatic mammal hypothesis.
That is a fun debunked pseudoscience idea, which is still fun because it kind of hits a couple of key points of like, oh, those are good points.
Right. Okay, next principle that gets talked about in the book and is important to understand is the progress principle. Happiness comes more from making progress towards goals than from achieving them. The journey matters more than the destination. And if you think about it in a quantifiable way, this is also something that comes up a lot in Thinking Fast and Slow. If you think about it in a quantifiable way, like per unit of happiness, you get many more units of happiness working towards a goal than the finite moment of having, quote, achieved the goal. If you're working towards being able to run a full marathon, for example, that moment of crossing the finish line feels really good, but it's the progress of working towards that goal that ultimately has many more units of happiness per time that you're getting.
And pulling this back to James Clear's Atomic Habits as well, that's one of his arguments for not discussing your goals, because the dopamine hits that you get are along the journey kind of reduce the probability of you reaching that finish line because you're already getting that dopamine return. Going on to the next one, the virtue hypothesis. Ancient thinkers were right that cultivating virtues and living according to one's strengths leads to a deeper, more lasting happiness than chasing pleasure.
I don't remember if he brings up this concept in the book, arete, the ancient Greek concept of arete. Does he bring it up here?
Can't remember.
Okay. It's been a few months since we last went page by page through the book. We're reviewing what we've noted and kind of just perusing what we've done. So last up, let's talk about the divinity hypothesis. Humans have a natural sense of the sacred and elevation. The feeling of being moved by others' goodness is a real and important emotion that binds communities. Haidt has done specifically a lot of research on what he eventually terms moral elevation, which is really neat to think about. This kind of coincides a lot with what we read about in a little book called The Sacred and Profane by Mircea Eliade, where there is a horizontal axis to human life and a vertical axis to human life. And the vertical axis is that which is spiritual. And that's not exactly how Haidt puts it, but that is very much what he describes is that y-axis of spiritual, that which is that feels uplifting. It's what we mean when we say we feel uplifted.
I'm so sorry, I can't remember where I was reading this or who wrote it, but they were talking about the absolution that's present in modern society, where they can feel a connection of absolution when they see a celebrity or politician or whoever doing a quote-unquote good deed, and that fills in for their need to do that good deed. Oh, well, I supported this person or idea, and they're going and doing this, not dirty work, but this tough work, and I feel an absolution from that. Say, like, participating in Nurse Appreciation Day, and they're like, oh, well, I feel a little bit less guilty because I'm putting that on someone else.
Interesting idea. Basically, getting a small residual sense of fulfillment from watching the TV show version of someone else performing a good or morally uplifting act.
Right. Get those feel-good neurons.
Interesting.
But moving on from that idea, taking all of Haidt's research, he really percolated these concepts, and he has great arguments where he ties in this modern psychology into what brings us happiness. And kind of as a spoiler, it's similar to those fun movies where the real treasure at the end is the friends they made along the way. In many ways, it's kind of cheesy looking at those, but from Haidt's research, it does appear that kind of is the answer, right? Notably, the main takeaways for his ideas that make us actually happy are basically strong social relationships and love, meaningful work and engagement, being part of something larger than yourself, the right balance in between challenge and skill, adversity and growth. Basically, painful events make stronger relationships, and stronger relationships make more happiness. Some people in modern parlance would say trauma bonding. And one other big note that he highlights throughout the book is what happiness isn't. And Haidt downplays the idea of happiness only coming from within.
Right. That is a key thing that I came away from the book with, is that happiness is a special blend of external and internal.
Right. Which is going to be great to dissect when we get into the discussion. There are still a lot of discussion, discourse, and academic arguments that stand on the side of Haidt's research isn't fully fledged out, and we don't have the full answer. Almost in some ways similar to the emergence of psychoanalysis for Freud's thoughts, where there's still a lot of arguments against what's currently being produced.
If I understand what you're saying, you're adding in a caveat that the academic fields related to his findings are not fully conclusive.
Correct. There's many academic arguments against his work not having sufficient research to back his claims.
Do you mean that there is the field in general, like the research in the field, or do you mean specifically like his work is being academically challenged?
His work is specifically being academically challenged. So many academics have been strong critics of him producing this general audience approach due to a lack of research backing his hypotheses from an academic perspective.
Yeah, we're going to have to dig into that after our main discussion.
We can do that when we hit the critiques portion of it.
Yeah, there's on the surface that sounds a little off. So I'd love to jump into that.
It's basically researchers saying you don't have enough data points.
Right.
Which I agree with them based on the critiques I read.
It depends on what they're saying, because there is oh, you can't say these things conclusively, which is being a little pedantic, but there's also like, oh, there's evidence that points in the exact opposite direction of stuff you're saying, which is an important conversation to be added. Then there's also the fact that there's underlying research that you can have more subjective conclusions off of that aren't necessarily like an on-off switch. Because of the trend line and direction of research and findings, we can make these more general understandings. Not necessarily conclusive, set in stone things, but we can say, hey, there's a trend line here in the research and what we know so far about human psychology and lived experience to say that, oh, it's a combination of internal and external experiences. That's nothing that you can objectively say, no, that's not possible. That's just general enough and just wisdom-based enough to perennially make sense.
And these are going to be great discourses we can really dissect into, because I think that's a lot of fun. I just wanted to add that caveat up front, where we're going to go through his book. I really like his book. I think he has great points. There's always more research to be done. So with that, Leo, would you like to kind of get into chapter by chapter? Because Haidt does a great job of having well-structured, self-contained chapters anyway to introduce his ideas.
That is one nice thing that I appreciate about the way the book is laid out, is that each chapter was mostly self-contained, but it also was laid out structurally in such a way that it built upon it. So, for example, chapter 1 talks about the divided self, which is an important concept to carry forward into all the other chapters. And so while reading the chapter by itself would give someone all they would need to take away what's in the chapter and the key concepts, and they would be equipped to walk about thinking with that. At the same time, the way he lays out the book makes it such that they add together, they accumulate in a very well thought out way. So chapter 1 is about the divided self. We mentioned it briefly in the overview. We'll just do a quick overview each chapter and the concepts there before we jump into our main discussion. But some of the things that he points out in this chapter is that we are a divided self in multiple ways of looking at it. Very simply, the mind versus the body. There's left brain versus right brain influences. This is called lateralization of brain function. Old brain versus new brain, meaning what the frontal cortex is doing compared to what other parts of the brain are doing. And controlled versus automatic. Again, both in the nervous system, but also in the rider and elephant metaphor that helps us understand this. It's an oversimplification to say that this one discrete section in the brain controls this very specific behavior. It's an overgeneralization, but there is lateralization that takes place, and there is a very interesting interplay between what is predominantly influenced and controlled by the left hemisphere and what is predominantly controlled and influenced by the right hemisphere of the brain. And a lot of it is more of like a push-pull, where it's not, oh, the right hemisphere is exerting control on this specific influence. It's in fact a very nuanced back and forth where it's exerting pressure to mitigate something that's happening in the left brain and vice versa. So there are left-right brain things that are legitimately able to be talked about and pointed to. It is a bit of an oversimplification, but that's not what he's talking about here. He's not giving the oversimplified version of pop science left brain, right brain.
I don't know sorry, you might have already said it, but from my memory, and I could be completely wrong, it was just he was bringing these ideas up that these are a whole bunch of historical stuff where people have thought that the mind has been divided.
That's part of it. That is part of it, but it's more so that there's many different angles you can look at the human self and see that we are divided. Like we are divided.
Reptilian brain, the mammalian brains. Let's go on.
Okay, that is a pretty good summary of the key concepts in chapter 1. And remember, this is where he introduces the elephant rider, which we've talked about and will carry on through the whole conversation, or we will ride this metaphor through this whole conversation. Chapter 2 is about changing your mind. The automatic emotional reactions of the elephant does what is called a priming effect, and this guides us throughout our lives. We can be primed by something unconsciously, and then we feel like that thought or emotion originates in the conscious thinking mind in the rider, but really it's originating from the elephant. And this is something that we can influence not directly but indirectly by changing that which is priming us. People even tend to choose mates and professions based on similarities to their own name. So if your last name is Smith, there is a non-zero bit of influence happening there that makes you do a job that's a little bit like a Smith.
I mean, your spouse also shares the same first letter as you, so clearly there's some correlation there.
That's true. That is true. We do share the first letter of our names.
That's fun. He also talks about in this chapter that the brain has a bias towards negativity. Although there is optimists and pessimists, we generally see an overall trend towards that negativity.
Right. That which is negative or potentially harmful or scary has an outsized signal compared to happy signals or calm signals.
And we can often see this in the research done for memory retention, where people much easier have a much easier time recalling negative memories rather than positive memories. So that's real fun.
One thing that they did in about 1,000 years ago for a while was it said that to have someone remember an important event, they had a kid present at the event while the king's, making an official deal or talking about something, and the kid is hit during the event, so the kid is kind of forced to dramatically remember what's happening. Don't know how true that is, but something I've heard.
That'd be fun.
I don't know that would be fun.
I apologize. I truncated my sentence. That would be fun to look more into to understand if that is an actual thing.
Important takeaway I got from this chapter is that there's only 3 ways with a good amount of evidence for how to actually change your mind. And he means literally changing your mind. 1 is meditation. There's a lot of good evidence that meditation can help you shift your mind in directions that you want. 2 is cognitive therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy has good evidence for it. And 3, medications such as Prozac and SSRIs in general are ways that can help you shift your brain state in a way that gives you a boost in the direction you need to go. And I appreciate how upfront and direct he is about the evidence for these things and their effects and what we know about them. He very much lays it out in a easy to understand and unbiased way.
And he also does a great job of bringing in that evidence, because lottery winners and paraplegics tend to return to the same baseline happiness, right? So it's even extreme external circumstances don't tend to change your overall happiness. It's very limited according to his hypotheses.
Okay, let's talk about chapter 3, reciprocity with a vengeance. He points out that humans are the only species able to be what we would call ultra-sociable, meaning live in very large cooperative groups. And he says that it seems like gossip plays a very important role in social groups, along with what we would think of as the golden rule: do unto others as you would have do unto yourself. And those two combined help exert influence and help promote social cohesion. So what was interesting to me in this chapter is the way he talked about the social benefit of gossip, which we think of as negative. And we're going to have a good discussion about this further on in the deep dive section here. Anything else you want to talk about from this chapter in particular?
No, I'm just happy to do kind of an overview for our listeners that haven't read the book, because we can give them kind of the tools to go through all the discussions with us.
Exactly. All right, tell us about chapter 4.
All right, chapter 4. As a part of our ultra-social selves, we are constantly trying to manipulate others' perceptions of ourselves without realizing what we're necessarily doing. And one of the... Does he bring this up? Yeah, he does bring it up. One of the things he talks about is Jesus said, we see the faults of others clearly, but we're blind to our own. And I see that in everyday life. Anyway, people get angry and upset at other people for the exact same actions they themselves will do.
What's the saying go? It's, if something someone is doing is bothering you, look in the mirror.
It's true. He also looks at what social psychology has to say about this, beginning with the work of Daniel Batson. Sounds like a Louisiana version of pronunciation. Batson. Anyways, Daniel Batson on cheating and self-justification, mentioning Robert Wright's description of our constitutional ignorance of hypocrisy. He pulls in a lot of work and a lot of research into this chapter, and I think he does a great job of interweaving other modern ideas into the faults of others.
One of the works that he referenced that the way he talks about it makes me want to read the book, and this is probably a direction we could go, is the book The Myth of Pure Evil by Roy Baumeister. That's one that the way he talks about the topic and the way we can just vilify people in a objectifying way really made me want to dive into that and look at that part of psychology and the human mind in that book. Okay, Chapter 5, The Pursuit of Happiness. It's a common idea that happiness comes from within and can't be found in external things. For a while in the 1990s, psychologists agreed with ancient sages such as Buddha and Epictetus that external conditions are not what matter. However, in this chapter, Haidt argues that we now know that some external circumstances do matter. He identifies ways of improving happiness by altering these, including being smart with money, and he argues that Western emphasis on action and striving has real merit when it comes to feeling life satisfaction. Again, there's a lot of good topics in here that we will bring up in the deep dive section. Joel, you want to tell us about Chapter 6?
There are many kinds of love, but Haidt asserts they all begin to make sense when you look where the love comes from and what it does. He examines John Bowlby's World Health Organization sponsored study and report, quote, maternal care and mental health. There's also fun subsequent monkey research by Harry Harlow. Very fun research.
I don't know if Harlow's research is what I would constitute as fun.
You know, I've been using the word fun today in a very sarcastic meaning tone. But he does a great job of helping add the different kinds of love and how we can help explain why people make so many mistakes in love and why philosophers hate love and give us bad advice about it.
Those grumpy philosophers. Okay, Chapter 7. Here's a Nietzsche quote. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. But this is not true for everyone. Adversity can result in post-traumatic stress disorder. Haidt discusses how and why some people grow from their suffering, along with ways of improving one's chances of finding post-traumatic growth. Adversity, as Robert Sternberg's research on wisdom shows, can make people more compassionate and better able to balance the needs of self and others. Chapter 8, The Felicity of Virtue. Haidt brings up Benjamin Franklin and shows how Franklin specifically tried to improve virtue in himself. Franklin had a very interesting method of everyday tracking his daily habits and had a very diary-like way and checklist type way of, hey, I need to do this every day. I need to be polite. I need to be friendly. I need to do X, Y, and Z. And that's a cool little tidbit about Franklin I did not know. And he gives examples like that to talk about virtue and its relationship to happiness. He points out that ancient thinkers like Aesop and Homer and the Old Testament point in the same direction as modern understanding of how allegories and stories and moral teachings can act as ways to train the elephant and the elephant and rider metaphor. You know, the stories that are found in Aesop's fables, the point of them is to improve what the ancients would call virtue. It's not really a word that we use much or in the same emphasis or way that the ancients actually did.
In many ways, when I read this chapter, it sounded like diligence would be a more modern word to help respect kind of what he's getting at, because he talks about utilitarianism, of how being virtuous, or basically, if I try to translate it infidelitously, diligence helps bring about happiness because you can drive towards that success. He brings in a good portion of positive psychology and other works.
Okay, Chapter 9, Divinity with or without God. And this is where he talks about moral elevation, using the metaphor of flatland, meaning living in a two-dimensional world. Haidt argues that the perception of sacredness and divinity are two basic features of the human mind. The emotions of disgust, moral elevation, and awe tell us about this dimension. The religious right can only be understood by acknowledging this dimension, which most liberals or secular thinkers ignore or misunderstand. The work of William James and of Abraham Maslow shows ways in which this dimension is also relevant to the non-religious. This chapter is where he gives that idea of the vertical axis in human experience, sacredness, awe. It's what we would retroactively call a religious experience. And that there is something to this. There's more than just the common lived experience. This is something that elevates us outside of ourselves and lets us access the feeling of participating in something larger than ourselves. I really appreciated this chapter, and he does a fantastic job of tying in ancient thought, and not necessarily ancient thought, but older thought like William James, and brings it to bear in a modern context that helps us understand it. I think this is also an area where he did a lot of research himself academically.
It is an easily overlooked prospect, even if you are non-religious, to have spiritual experiences that heighten your understanding of the world or heighten your connectivity to something larger than yourself. Does have a key element to having that sustained happiness or sustained joy.
Going to tell us about Chapter 10?
All right, Chapter 10, which I really enjoy because it ties together classic 1900s thoughts and thoughts beforehand. Haidt discusses the meaning of life, making the distinction in between a purpose for life and the purpose within life. Love and work give a sense of meaning to life. He brings up a great study that establishes the concept of vital engagement, which characterizes work with the most sense of purpose.
And that's what we would call a flow state, which he defines as the perfect combination of difficulty and expertise.
Right. And the phrase he also uses is cross-level coherence. Cross-level coherence within one's self and life is also vital. Coherence between the physical, psychological, and socio-cultural levels. He argues that religion is an involved mechanism for creating that coherence for us. So it's not just within, it's not just without, it's really in between.
And then he ends with Chapter 11 on balance, where he brings up a yin and yang way of looking at happiness, where he brings it all together, where he ties, hey, we can take stuff from wisdom, we can take stuff from modern science, and true happiness, which he concludes in the Chapter 10, he reinforces is a combination of internal and external factor, and all things being in balance.
Great. I think that's a really good truncated summary of his book. And with that, anything that you want to add on kind of concluding his work?
No, I think that's a good overview of the book, and then we will, after a quick break, jump into some more deep dive portions of it.
All right, we'll be right back. All right, and we're back from our break, and we're going to get right into the discussions. In the introduction section, subtitled Too Much Wisdom, you got it? All right, I want to make sure you're good. Haidt starts by highlighting a paradox unique to the modern world. As humans, we are always seeking answers to important life questions, but we have an overwhelming abundance of easily accessible wisdom. He says that wisdom is now so cheap and abundant that it floods over us. The paradox is that the quantity itself undermines the quality of our engagement.
So Joel, living in 2026, can you think of any real-life examples of where the abundance is overwhelming the quality of information shows up in your daily life?
Taking it outside of the realm of wisdom, I feel that we are constantly inundated with information and quotes, everything else that ends up taking away from our engagement. I think Haidt here is exactly correct in that we lose that quality because we have too much to engage in. We have too many good books. We have too much that we have to learn from and connect with.
I think it's telling that you prefaced by saying stepping outside of wisdom, because the very definition of wisdom is something that we have to grapple with and think about, because so much gets labeled as important or urgent or vital, and everything has an urgency and immediacy and a star next to it for important, that it's hard to tell what is actually important. And I think part of the information overload that we run into is it's very hard to tell what actually matters and is important, because so much language is couched in a way to engage and grab attention in the information ecosystem. There's so many little bits of data that it becomes more and more competitive for attention.
And as we're on the dawn of the AI era of creating and generating information, I think we're about to see a rapid flood and onset of complete misinformation that we will rebound from, but I think it'll take time to catch up. The same thing I believe happened at the start and dawn of the internet era, and we eventually rebounded from that. So I think we're going to see the same thing in AI.
There is a Wild Wild West time period of the internet age that did have beautiful things and artifacts of little ecosystem and niche places to go hang out, and more it's becoming more like a corporatocracy in the internet ecospace of where we're at now, that's more dull and less interesting in many ways than what it used to be.
I think we find that beauty in frontiers all across the real and digital world. Like you're saying, back then, forums had a beautiful landscape of uncontrolled chaos where people really got to connect in ways they never did before. But now we're seeing, as you mentioned, the Meta or other large corporations controlling and regulating how things operate, and a standard procedure where we don't get to have that Wild West frontier.
And taking out any latent insidiousness or suspicion. The word you use, standard, I mean, there's a standardization. If there's a wide variety of forums and sites for people to congregate on, and there's so many different ecosystems they engage in, that adds to a lot of, sticking with the ecological metaphor here, it adds to the biodiversity of the internet. Whereas if almost everyone's on the top 3, 4, 5 major platforms, that really truncates diversity. Even if you can have a diverse array of conversations and content on them, there's still a standardized platform, and there's still standardized ways that you're engaging with content, other people's stuff. And then you can add the layer of conspiratorial and not necessarily malicious intent, but mercenary intent that goes on top of that, and affects how we engage with the information.
So with so much information being available, with so much, so to speak, wisdom accessible to people through books, internet, and podcasts, everything else, do you see any other effects besides what we just talked about?
This kind of reminds me of Byung-Chul Han's ideas in Burnout Society, where in a society where everything is possible, you begin to lose meaning. You feel pulled along into that ecosystem of a vast array of information. Because there's so much information at your fingertips, you feel compelled to engage with it and pursue it, and pursue the consumption of information, even if it's meaningless scrolling on a social media platform, or if it's perusing other bits of information, even Wikipedia, which I love. There's just so much information right there at your fingertips with no friction between my eyeballs and grabbing that information, that it's very natural to feel pulled along with it. And so with that comes a paradoxical vacuum of meaningfulness. If you're at the buffet and you look to the left down the line of the buffet and the right down the buffet, and there's gleaming food and glittering jewels of snacks and confections in every direction, it all begins to lose its meaning. Whereas if I were to make you a single good meal where there's no other options and it's one single option, the whole meaning of what you're engaging with there and consuming completely changes.
As Han puts it, can becomes should.
Yes, exactly. Can becomes should. So Jonathan Haidt's solution to this information abundance dilemma is to pick out a few great ideas. And that's in capital letters, great ideas. Slow down and savor these great ideas instead of tearing through the information buffet in front of us. What do you think of this solution?
It is indeed a solution. I think a worthwhile solution. Perhaps not the only solution, but nonetheless a great approach when you're not sure what to do. I believe it is better to engage deeper with smaller pieces than a broad spectrum. This is indeed my philosophy when I travel as well. As you know, I try to take multiple weeks or a month in a place, and I really delve into that single area, as opposed to being on the go nonstop across a new land. And in this case, I also agree with the author for information. Let us grapple with and tackle with a few ideas to start with before we broad spectrum try to become a jack of all trades, as they say.
I think it is an interesting approach to the quality over quantity way of viewing a set of options and information. I think another thing that it makes me think of is the idea of know the way narrowly, and that will allow you to know the way broadly. And I find that that sense of can impels should come up sometimes. Let's take reading, for example, where this is a podcast about reading. There's so many books out there I want to read, and the number of books I've read never seems like it's enough. And my to-read list is longer than I have left in life to read it. And yet I will still sometimes reread something, or I will reread something and dig deeper into literature and sources and what other people are thinking. And on the one hand, that feels like I'm standing still in a way because I'm not making progress on reading a wider variety of books or conquering more of my to-read list. But the thought that calms me down there is that no, just because I am in a way only engaging with this one work right now and spending more time on this one work, delving into it deeper, there's almost a fractal nature of ways I can engage with it and continually find new things, even though it is technically a limited thing, especially if it is a very good work. You know, there's only so much you can do with a lighthearted or superficial work. You know, I don't think I can get years of scholarly study out of Project Hail Mary, for example. Nothing wrong with that. You know, as we talked about, it is a tasty, easily digestible read. But something like a Dostoevsky novel, on the other hand, is something I could probably spend 10, 20 years and not exhaust the amount of things there are to look at and examine and look at different angles. So that's an idea that resonates with this. Grab a few great ideas and engage deeply with them rather than being overwhelmed by the information buffet available.
And I think it's a general good approach, not only in seeking wisdom or seeking information, but in life itself. I would rather savor a few moments than overemphasize a multitude of surface moments. But that is just a personal philosophy.
So besides his great ideas solution to this problem, do any other solutions come to mind for you for dealing with the information buffet and the glut of, quote, wisdom available for access and digestion out there?
One approach, but not full solution, I've employed in my life is knowing what I don't want to know. So, for example, astrology. I avoid absorbing any information whatsoever about that, or about actors or directors, any of that. I know nothing about that. I'll enjoy a good movie, watching with the family, but I actively avoid absorbing information. And we have a good friend in our in-person book club who tells us that he actively avoids absorbing information, especially about directions, for example. And he touts proudly that he doesn't even know the route to get to his home. He always uses GPS. And his approach, I think, is a way and solution to, well, I just don't want to absorb that so my brain can think about other stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't think that's a form of ostrich head in the sand. I think that is a a vigorous curation of the information you're allowing in. I will sometimes I will, someone will come up to me and say, hey, look at this thing I saw on social media. Or, did you see this meme? Hey, let me show you this funny video. And it causes a little bit of an argument because I'm like, no, I don't want that in my head. I just don't want that in my head. I'm sure it's funny. I'm sure you found something engaging, but don't put that in my head. I just don't want it.
Especially in this day and age, that's what we need. Now, if we lived back in the 1930s on a farm, sure, all the information we could let in because there was not that much, right? The pipe didn't have to be squeezed at all. Okay, so with that.
So that is that introduction section, Too Much Wisdom. And I don't know, I don't have anything else there. Let's just jump straight into chapter 1.
Okay, great. Let's get into chapter 1, what Haidt calls the divided self. He states that human thinking depends on metaphors and that, quote, we understand new or complex things in relation to things we already know, end quote. He also introduces an important metaphor that is a key to how he explains the main idea in this and other chapters. He gives us the metaphor that the self or the mind is like a rider on an elephant, where the riders are conscious thinking and the elephant is the rest of our mind, our subconscious automatic systems.
So a great thing about when we read this book was it came very closely in time to when we read Thinking Fast and Slow. So there was a very nice synergy between the thoughts between these two books. And we've already mentioned this metaphor and that connection, but it's something that is a pleasant supertextual context for me, at least, to have those two books as experiences and in things I engaged with so close together in time. So besides his rider-elephant metaphor, are there other metaphors that you've encountered that have helped you think about the mind or the self?
Like you mentioned, Thinking Fast and Slow, having System 1 and System 2. I think an older model has been the id, ego, superego. We also have...
But is there any metaphors for you specifically that you kind of resonate with or ring out to you? So, for example, for me, while you're thinking about that, is the iceberg metaphors. Like what's our conscious mind and what we can consciously engage with is just the tip of the iceberg peeking out of the surface of the water, and the vast majority of what is our self and our mind is beneath it. A little bit more Jungian in that sense. What about you?
So, like you were saying, the iceberg or the Jungian idea of how little is available versus how much we don't fully understand.
That helps me quite a bit. Another one that comes to mind is when we say the lizard brain. I know it's not scientifically accurate, but it is a very persistent metaphor.
It's a fun metaphor to talk about deeper autonomic responses. Still useful.
So a very key metaphor that we can ride through this whole conversation and that will help us. You see what I did there?
Ha.
So when you encountered the author's claim that human thinking depends on metaphor, what was your initial reaction to that, and how do you feel about that idea? Did you have any knee-jerk reactions to the idea that we think in metaphors?
I agreed with the author because the human brain is built to run off of stories, metaphors, and connections. We have, in my mind, a primal or innate ability to create these stories, to explain things. And it's easier because we have an emotional connection to those stories, and those become hyper real for us. We are just a pile of metaphors, and what we see is a pile of metaphors.
I'm having a hard time remembering exactly what my initial reaction was to this because I can't remember how much I've encountered it put this exact way, but thinking in metaphors makes sense for just the extreme association ability our minds have. So it's not a way that we teach kids to think about thinking. In fact, I don't know that we do enough teaching about thinking about thinking. I think that's something we should do more of and more purposefully. But it is a useful way to think about thinking, that we think in metaphors. How many times do you think I can work on the word think?
I'm sure we could do a few more. But for our culture, although we've had the same brain, we really have had a change in culture about how we think. Empirical thinking, for example, is not an innate ability for humans, and it came about with multiple eras of studying and learning and philosophy.
Right. empirical thinking is this addendum to the vast subjective foundational layer of how we actually think and engage with the world around us.
So thinking about thinking, I think, is a useful thing to talk about and teach.
So that's the main idea from chapter 1. I just wanted us to go and pet the elephant on our journey through the chapters again. Anything else you want to talk about from chapter 1 that stood out to you? Okay. So sticking with that elephant rider metaphor a little bit more, Haidt takes us through a few different divisions of the self. And this is after the metaphor part in chapter 1. He goes through, he's really highlighting the fact that we are divided in many different ways. So he takes us through the mind versus body division, left brain versus right brain, new brain versus old brain, and controlled versus automatic. In discussing these divisions, he gives several examples, such as how the gut is like a second brain, or that the brain's hemispheres are almost like separate entities. Was there anything, Joel, that you found particularly surprising or engaging or made you question your perspectives more?
None of this really engaged my lenses that I view life through. It is something I've wanted to learn more about because I think it's on the precipice of current research about how much our gut influences our neurological system and how those interconnect through chemical sensors and chemical communication. So that's like a little tangent road of hyperlinks that I wish to go down when I have some more free time.
Right. I want the master and his emissary version of the gut-brain axis. I really want that, but I don't think our knowledge is quite there yet. And speaking of The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, that is a book that I really want to read with you because it's just fun neuroscience to read about.
We'll add it to the list. Was there anything that surprised you or had you question your perspective?
No, not necessarily, because these are all ideas and perspectives that I've encountered and dealt with prior, but just like most of the things presented in the book, I think Jonathan Haidt does a really good job of presenting things in very specific angles to get his point across, and that he does a very good job. He doesn't cram anything into fitting his particular perspective. It's almost the other way around it. The way the pieces are laid out, he finds the best perspective by moving himself around rather than the objects, and then describes that perspective. I never felt like he took bits and pieces of evidence and said, hey, I'm trying to squeeze this into the point I'm trying to make. I think his command of the information and evidence that he brings to bear is perfectly in line with his points and what he's trying to do. So he does a very masterful job of many of the lay science information books that are out there that I've read. He does probably the best job that I can think off the top of my head of not trying to shove evidence and data into fitting his point or his conclusion. He synthesizes it, but there's no hiccup. And his presentation here of the divided self and the various divisions is very fluid, very seamless, and is a great tour of reminding us just how divided we actually are as an entity. So, speaking of those divisions, I'd like to zoom in now onto one of those divisions a little bit more, because I think there's some fun things to talk about here. So, new versus old. The author here, he explains that the development of the frontal cortex is what gives us our ability to reason and think rationally. Interestingly, the cortex also seems to allow us to have a wider and deeper range of emotionality. This is contrary to Plato's charioteer idea. This is where reason needs to be driving and controlling the emotions, and the emotions are like horses pulling the chariot. The author even states that, quote, human rationality depends critically on sophisticated emotionality. It is only because our emotional brains work so well that our reasoning can work at all, end quote. Do you find the synergy between reasoning and emotions surprising?
Not necessarily, but I think we have discussed this, both just you and I in person, but as well on the podcast about Project Hail Mary, where the current understanding I have, and I'm always willing to change my perspective, is that social animals become more sophisticated, become more rational, because it increases the complexity that's required of the organism to grow and develop. So in order for us to be hyper-social or be able to be in larger herds, you have to have more reasoning, logic, and capabilities behind that. So they would, in my mind, go hand in hand in a biological perspective, including xenobiology, as we talked about in Project Hail Mary.
And you're, in this example you're using, which is a great tie-in, thank you for that tie-in, you're relating the hypersocial nature of intelligent group animals to the degree of emotionality needed, and that rationality and logic and ability to reason is nice, but it sits on top of a foundation of emotionality, rather than the push-pull dynamic that the charioteer metaphor from Plato is about.
Correct. That would be my current understanding of emotionality and reason, how they would go hand in hand.
I think that's the most natural outlook to have on it, and I think for a long time Plato's idea dominated, understandably so, because of the development of logic and reasoning and the focus on that. And that was a necessary move for us to go through all the idea evolutions that we've gone through to lead us to the pinnacle of reasoning and logic, to be able to think empirically. You know, the ultimate brainchild, so to speak, of how logic and reason have grown over the eons. But then there's a cost to that, which means that emotionality, emotions, and feelings get relegated to a lower tier unnecessarily. And now we're seeing a shift of the pendulum back closer to the middle, where we're beginning to understand, no, we are only able to reason because of the emotions. And so there is a synergy that is necessary. And that, you bringing up the Project Hail Mary idea and hypersocial animals and what they're able to accomplish because of the socialness and the emotionality that sits on, reminds me just of the difference of our pets, cats and dogs, where a dog has so much more social capability than a cat, and a dog can love you and interact with you a lot more. And then cats, it's kind of like, give or take. They kind of like you, but you're not really sure. And that's because they just biologically don't have the same social capabilities. They're much more solitary creatures, and you just can't engage with them as broadly or deeply as with a much more social animal friend like a dog.
Very great connection with the animals there. Fun stuff with the animals is some of the research is looking at how dogs have facial expressions that cats don't have the ability to do, for the exact reason you've already explained. Why do you think we tend to put reason as superior to emotions in the modern world?
I think it's because of what I mentioned, of just the outgrowth of reason into the ability for us to think empirically. There's so much that we've accomplished through empirical thinking that it's, as a new thing, when you get a new thing, you get obsessed with it. Like, this is the best thing. This is it. This is the new thing. We've got friends like that they find a new thing, and then that becomes the end all be all, the best thing, the new thing. Fantastic, right? And it's just fun to watch that. And I do the same thing. This new book, this is the best book. And as a species, if you think about it, empirical thinking is so new, so recent, looking at evolutionary time span. It was a blip of a fraction of a second ago, when we got empirical thinking as a thing. And it's, like you said, it's not something we can innately have. It's something we have to learn. So it's passed on through ideas and word of mouth rather than genetically. But still, on an evolutionary timescale, it's just a second ago. We just got this new toy. And I think that newness and novelty and the nascent stages of empirical thinking that we're in makes us downgrade emotionality and feelings, because those are much, much older evolutionary. Those are the older toys, the older things that we've had for much longer than empirical thinking. So I think that's why we downplay emotions, and we're on the beginning processes of fixing that.
although we have downplayed emotions previously, I still think we have underestimated how powerful emotional truth is. Even nowadays, as we're coming to terms with both empirical thinking and the emotional man or human, we still see people don't only pick the empirically good choice. They sometimes only pick the emotionally true or good choice, so to speak. Politicians or media, I think we have plenty of examples where people don't pick a empirical choice, they pick an emotional choice.
Correct. I don't think that hardly anyone ever picks an empirical choice.
So, although we have suppressed...
We just like to think that we think empirically.
We like to think that we think empirically all the time, especially if you are a rational human and you feel that you are making the correct choice based on data analysis. Alas, emotional truth is still weighted heavily even if we don't recognize it.
I think part of that nascent stage that we're in with empirical thinking is highlighted by the fact that researchers and academics who are supposed to be the vanguard of empirical thinking, and that's supposed to be their job, run into issues all the time of, making subjective and emotional decisions that compromise or dilute the empirical results that they're supposed to be out there getting for us. Like we run into silly academic squabbles that stymie academic progress sometimes. We're like, why are you doing this? Like when new ideas pop up or a new thinker pops up and there's backlash on, older ideas, when engagement needs to happen with newer ideas and then it needs to be put into the open forum and critiqued from every angle. Or when researchers sometimes fib on data or nudge data a little bit, or, hey, this graph looks like it might be from AI, instead of focusing on purportedly what their job is.
Yes. And when you say that, it reminds me of one of the famous Einstein quotes where people were pushing against some of his newer ideas because they were new and undeveloped. There was a publication of 100 authors against Einstein, pushing against his most recent breakthroughs in physics, and Einstein replied, quote, "Why 100? If I were wrong, one would be enough," end quote.
Right.
And there was a lot of emotion behind a whole bunch of mathematicians and scientists pushing against Einstein because of his breakthroughs and his connections to everything he was a part of.
Right. And there's nothing wrong with thinking that he's wrong, but they were swapping what they were doing. They were saying, you're wrong empirically, you're wrong objectively, when what they were really doing was making a subjective decision and a subjective judgment and then masking it as empirical rational thinking, which now, hindsight allows us to see the foolishness for what it was. An abuse of the banner of empirical thinking, unfortunately. So even though we know that Plato's charioteer idea contracts biology, Joel, do you find the charioteer metaphor helpful at all, or do you think it may do more harm than good to think in that way? Do you want a reminder of what the metaphor is?
I don't use that metaphor, nor necessarily ascribe to using it. It's not one of the lenses or models that I apply when I try to think about the world or actions and events.
Have you read Plato's Republic?
No.
Oh, that would be a great one for us to cover on the podcast. We'll see what the listeners say, but that Plato's Republic would be a fantastic one for us to cover.
Do you like his metaphor?
I do like his metaphors. This one in particular is one that, even though it's many years now since my intro to philosophy class where I encountered this metaphor, when we had to read the Republic, I still have fond feelings for this metaphor and kind of how it stands out to me. And I don't know that I still find it useful as a mental tool. So let's move on now to chapter 2, titled Changing Your Mind, where Jonathan Haidt introduces Boethius, an ancient Roman who experienced a lot of fortune and then a lot of misfortune. After his rise and fall, Boethius then wrote a famous philosophical tract while waiting for his execution. One of his ideas that we encounter is that, quote, "No man can ever be secure until he has been forsaken by fortune," end quote. And fortune there is a capital F. This work that is being alluded to is the Consolation of Philosophy, I believe, and it's a famous ancient philosophical tract that, again, something I learned back in my college philosophy class days.
What fun. I love a good philosophical thought process during or around executions, as we're currently reading in our most recent book, The Idiot.
Yeah, a lot of thoughts around executions there. Dostoevsky does a great job of talking about executions.
So what do you feel about this particular quote?
I like Boethius's approach to kind of personifying fortune and philosophy. He gives them both, capital lettered names as proper entities and engages with them in his work as entities, anthropomorphized entities. And we see this type of portrayal of fortune as a fickle figure who comes and goes usually portrayed as feminine, comes and goes at her leisure, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. Something that's very similar to how you see in literature in ancient works as well, how the sea is portrayed in a fickle way, in a way that's, you love it, but it comes and goes and does what it wants.
In a whimsical, capricious manner.
Yep, and it embodies all the random, depersonalized malice of nature. So I like thinking about personifying entities like that. I like works that do that. And I agree with the quote itself. It stands out. No man can ever be secure until he has been forsaken by fortune. I think it requires hard times and difficult times and going through them and coming out the other side for you to feel secure, because you then have contrast for what is the bad time and what is the good time. If you live an idyllic life and you're constantly sheltered and never experience hardship, then there is a kind of a lack of security there because you don't have a contrast for that. But when you have contrast in difficult times, it makes the good times actually good, as opposed just to the status quo.
It makes me think of indigenous cultures and in many other cultures that we no longer have, but the majority of the world had some type of adulthood ritual. And although some of those rituals could be more celebratory, oftentimes, depending on the ecosystem or environment, they were arduous and difficult. We have stories of indigenous people, adulthood rituals being, you have to stick your hand into bullet ant nests and you have to sit there and endure the pain. And that's just one example, but there's many examples of someone having to deal with a super difficult situation. And I think that marks on the child, man or woman, you did this difficult activity, so never forget that your inner strength can keep you going in hard times.
It helps you define that inner strength, and it's common across all nascent cultures where they develop what you're calling it's called a rite of passage, and they've all had it. And people who are cultures that are still in touch with their older roots still have rites of passage. And I think more modern societies, at least here in America, don't have as much emphasis on rites of passage. If we think back to Atomic Habits, he talks specifically about misogis that's Comfort Crisis. We think back to Comfort Crisis. He brings up misogis and, undertaking something so difficult, there's a 50-50 chance that you'll fail and there's danger involved. And it really focuses you almost on a spiritual level of, where's my limits? Let me see my limits. It just helps define who you are and focuses you. And almost in a way, he doesn't use this language, but for me, it almost makes you more real, doing a difficult ritualistic activity on purpose. And one example of that is running a really tough race. For a lot of people, it's running a really tough race. Some people, it's doing like a Spartan race or a Tough Mudder, which we've done before. And, coming out the other side of that, especially if it's your first time, is it's mind-blowing. It's almost psychedelic. Like, wow, I can do this. I can accomplish this.
I was able to do this or endure this. I can do anything.
Right. And you find your new limits. And not to wax poetic about barbell training, but I will for a minute, is pushing yourself to do a more difficult challenge, more difficult weight, every single time you do that, you're finding your limitation. You're clarifying the definition of who you are and where your limits are, and where the border is between what you can do and what's just beyond your grasp. And knowing those borders really helps you feel confident about how you're going through the world and how your relationship with yourself manifests in your daily life. And the being abandoned by fortune, as Boethius is saying, for me is, yeah, you have to have bad times. You have to have bad times to have good times. For me, there's several dark periods in my life that were very difficult. One of them that comes to mind is, when our father died. It not only was that a very grievous blow because it was so sudden and unexpected, but on top of that, that's when I came down with, this was all back during the awful COVID times. That's when I came down with COVID very bad and had just struggled with long COVID for about 2 years after that. And on top of that, there was a lot of sudden things that I had to do career-wise, a lot of shifts that had to happen that were immensely difficult at that time, all within the same few days. And the next 3 years after that were extremely challenging and difficult and stretched the limitations of what I was capable of and my relationships to their limit. New limits were found and encountered. And now that I'm on the other side of that, the good times really feel like good times. Being abandoned by fortune for a little bit, and now I can feel a lot more secure. What about you? Do you have examples?
I'll try to rein it in so I don't talk forever, but our father passing away, as I tell people, was the most difficult emotional challenge I've ever had to face. But in many ways, I try to think about it in a positive aspect for how we can grow from these very difficult times. The most useful, I find, my difficult times and lack of fortune, even though I constantly feel fortuitous, is I have a deeper trust of future Joel. I worry less about the future. I'm less anxious because in my mind, when Joel gets into that position or situation, I trust he will figure it out. That has also guided me through my decisions in life and how I choose my career, activities, or what I do. So when I head to another area, whether the wilderness or another country, I trust that I will figure that out at that time while I'm there. I trust when I go on this camping trip that future Joel will figure it out because I've figured it out before.
I like that idea of going through something difficult allows you to have more trust in future Joel. Boethius's discussion here of feeling secure, I like that way of looking at it as temporally. Like you can trust yourself further out into time, and that gives you confidence and a feeling of security in the present moment. I like that. I like that way of looking at it.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
No, I am ready to jump on to the next fun idea for us to discuss.
Well, right before we do that, we'll insert some interlude music.
Okay.
And we're back from our break to put in that interlude music, and we're going to get right into the idea of a built-in lycometer.
Yes, we are still in chapter 2. Let's talk about the lycometer. So, Haidt explains that we get a small, mostly subconscious bit of pleasure from hearing or seeing our own name, even if it's just a resemblance. As evidence of this effect, the author discusses the work of a scientist named Pelham, who studied the lycometer. Quote, "The unsettling implication of Pelham's work is that the 3 biggest decisions most of us make, what to do with our lives, where to live, and whom to marry, can all be influenced, even if only slightly, by something as trivial as the sound of a name." End quote. Joel, do you find this idea unsettling, comical, both? And have you seen any examples of this in real life?
The idea of the power of a name was very present, almost as though they would talk about whatever you name that child, you're kind of tying them to a destiny. So in a way, they were right, because you are tying them to a particular destiny in how you name your child. And we see in more nuanced context, because we do socioeconomic studies about children's names and their ability to get jobs or get into certain universities. And with Pelham's work, we see it impact even more of, say, the love life and who we marry, which that's very interesting. I didn't know that before reading this in the book.
Do you find the idea unsettling that some of your life decisions can be ever so slightly influenced by this nominal determinism? What if there was the smallest nudge? How do you feel about that?
I don't think it would bother me, honestly. I feel extremely fortuitous in my current life, and it wouldn't bother me. But it does make me think of a fun episode that happened in Futurama. Amongst the many episodes, this one episode, the robot, who is a hedonist, Bender, talks about how every small decision is a dive into a whole new world of possibilities, and he laments and is tormented by which sunglasses to wear, because it opens a whole new world of possibility. And then, of course, the counter to that in that episode is someone saying there's no free will, it's all determinism anyway, it doesn't matter.
I think it's both a little, just ever so slightly unsettling. Maybe we should put a little bit more effort into the naming of things, which is already held to be an important thing, but we could always give it a little bit more importance. But it is also comical, because you get funny examples. There's a fun alliteration between me and my wife's names, and I don't know that my name has influenced my career choices. But hey, if it did, I didn't realize it. Did not realize it. But it's a very interesting idea. I do like it.
In regards to the whole naming, I do believe what you name your child will influence what their life will be.
I agree. I think naming someone is very important. You would say that our names probably don't affect our destinies in general all that much.
It's hard to say how much it affects it. I do agree that it does affect it.
It's not like we can ever A/B test it.
Unless you have twins, I guess. That's about as close as you could get, but...
That's it. Yeah, it's as close as you can get.
But we're never going to have that full answer. What a fun thought experiment to think about how it does affect you.
Right. It is a fun thought experiment. That was just a quick little avenue to walk down there with the nominal determinism that's mentioned here. Do you have any other thoughts on naming and the effects of names and the way that our lycometer works when it sees something similar or recognizable?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, let's move on. Haidt states that there are 3 reliable ways to change your mind. And he's using that term there in the variety of ways that you can interpret that statement of change your mind. He gives us meditation, cognitive therapy, and Prozac. In discussing these 3 different methods, he also points out a contradiction in our culture, that we endorse, quote, relentless self-improvement as well as authenticity, but we often escape the contradiction by framing self-improvement as authenticity, end quote. Joel, I am excited to talk about this because I think this matches up very well with some of the previous things we've talked about, especially Burnout Society, especially Atomic Habits. Joel, tell me what you think about how people escape the contradiction between authenticity and self-improvement by saying self-improvement is authenticity. Or do you even agree with it? Let's start there first. What do you think of the idea itself? And then tell me your thoughts about the idea.
We have certainly overindulged in the idea self-improvement and that being who you are, the originality of constantly improving yourself. And it's a hard trap to not find yourself in, as we talk about with our current culture, in changing our mind, thinking about that meditation, cognitive therapy, or certain medications.
You're saying as opposed to the 3 methods he's mentioning, or are you saying specifically in relation to self-improvement being masked as authenticity?
Self-improvement being masked as authenticity, but there is merit, I think, against Haidt's argument here that those are the only 3 ways, because I believe you can make yourself become what you do. You can wire your brain to get the dopamine out of certain activities. But is that you becoming who you are through that self-improvement, or is it you changing who you are?
Or is it you looking at it a little bit more deterministically, or is it you leaning into what you're already good at? So this is an idea we talked about with Atomic Habits of, if someone is already disciplined by nature, then they are going to be good at behaving in a disciplined way and sticking to habits and goals. And therefore, we are confusing which direction causality is going. The disciplined nature is causing the goals, but then that robs people of the freedom to choose to be disciplined or choose to be good at adhering to goals or pursuing goals.
Typically, our society rewards discipline.
Right. But there's a lot of times when people are naturally good at something and then they reverse engineer that and say, hey, let me teach you how to, on purpose, do this thing that I'm naturally good at. You see that all the time with athletes, or take a stab here at influencers, people who are naturally thin or naturally thin-skinned or naturally just aesthetically blessed, who then reverse engineer that and convince themselves and others that, oh, I can teach you to look like me because just work out like I do. Eat this colorful, Pinterest, aesthetically pleasing, silly meal that I eat, or the silly smoothie I eat. And do the things I do, and you can look like me, when they're mistaking the causality direction there.
Exactly.
So as far as this framing of self-improvement as authenticity, I think it's a beautiful pairing with Byung-Chul Han, as you mentioned. I mean, I feel like a younger version of me very much did this in a pursuit of trying to be authentic and, define myself. I think I leaned into self-improvement and discipline and pursuing of goals as an easy out for what would be authentic. And it's a painful process to find your authenticity and be your authentic self. And it's very easy to over-identify with what you do or how you do it.
Very easy to do. I find in my past, it was easy to have self-identity wrapped up in what a goal was.
Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with just think about if you really like a band and you're wearing that band's t-shirt, and people sometimes identify as, I am a X, insert whatever musician you want. I am such fan of musician. That is part of my identity. I'm a fan of this, or I'm a fan of this show, or I'm a fan of this fictional universe of media. And there's nothing wrong with that. And people, you and I are both nerds and are into nerdy things, but it's so easy, especially in our buffet of information and entertainment that we have at our fingertips, to mistake the thing that is interesting to you and the thing that you get brain pleasure out of for who you are. And when you take those things away, figuring out what is underneath is a painful process.
I don't know where this came from. It's not from me, but they were mocking people back in the early days of Facebook where they had an identity of, here's all of these things that I didn't create that are my representation of who I am. I watch this show. I follow this sports team. I do all of this. And here's my consumerism. That is my identity.
Sports is another great example of that, yeah.
And that's a super easy way that is socially acceptable to mask originality or authenticity or who you are as a person. But I also don't want us or our listeners or anyone to get too caught up in the idea of constantly inventing yourself, right? And Byung-Chul Han
that's a fun narcissistic trap. Yeah, specifically speaking of Byung-Chul Han. Yeah, that is a very narcissistic trap to fall into.
Exactly. And so that's an easy way to over fatigue and exhaust yourself of like, I constantly have to have this grand self-identity and I constantly have to invent myself and who I am.
Right.
How about you just be you and relax about it?
Right. There's an interesting paradoxical zen that occurs in my mind, now that you're saying that, of what it means to be authentic. If you focus too much on authenticity, you're not being authentic. Interestingly enough, that's a good point. That's another great book we should do on the podcast is Zen and the Art of Archery. Have you read that short little book?
No.
Oh, Joel, you're going to love it.
I'm sure.
You're gonna love it.
I love Zen. I love all of that philosophy that's built up around it.
Yeah. So many great things to talk about here. Okay, but let's move along with what we are talking about here. There's so much we can get into. We can do a whole episode on self-improvement as authenticity and the contradiction therein. But let's move along. So also in this section, the readers ask, which of the following sounds most true? Quote, be all that you can be, end quote. Or, quote, this above all, to thine own self be true, end quote. What do you think, Joel? Which one of those rings more true to you? Be all that you can be, or this above all, to thine own self be true?
I think that's a tough one. Both have things. I think that's a tough one. Both of them have things we can really attach to. And I just want to be ambiguous and not choose either one because it's tough. But it reminds me of a quote you told me about of what was left to be buried. And I think about that, and I still struggle with that question of be all that you can be, or live life, what does it matter, just relax and enjoy the ride. And both of those are tough because if I relax and enjoy too much, then maybe I don't actually accomplish as much as I could have accomplished. And the other part of my brain is like, well, we only get to be Joel one time. Therefore, let us be completely all out and do all things that we can do before death.
Between the two, I would say that be all that you can be pulls at me a little bit more. Sounds more true.
Very understandable. I get that. I get that above the other one.
And that's interesting. He brings those out to show the push and pull between self-improvement and authenticity, and that there is a bit of a paradoxical relationship between the two.
There is a paradoxical relationship, and I think there is a thin medium to what you can truly be authentic and what you would see, like you talked about, a Zen mind state where you are just living and not stressing about being all you can be all the time, or being authentic or self-improving. You are just existing.
Yeah. And it's, either a little oxymoronical or paradoxical in that it's not just blissful ignorance, it's a kind of purposeful ignorance or purposeful manipulation of your perspective. Because if it's too inwardly focused, then you're going to be blind to that which is around you, and then you are embodying the definition of what it would be to be egotistical or narcissistic. And if it's the opposite, if your perspective is too thoroughly externalized and too thoroughly riveted onto that which is external, then you are alien to yourself and you don't quite know who it is that's doing the looking, and you over-identify with that with which you are identifying. Jung talks a lot about that push and pull, and his writings on personality are the beginning rudimentary layers of what we eventually in popular psychology talk about as extroversion and introversion. But the Jung was originally talking about how focused you are. If you're so inwardly focused, then that comes with its own proclivities and habits and personality inclinations. If you're extremely externally focused outside of yourself, it comes with its own blind spots and peculiar ways of showing up in the world. And I think in the essence of what we're talking about here, that there's a Zen kind of medium that you can balance between the inner and outer. And that's kind of the through line through this whole book of the conclusion he comes up with. Spoiler, we've already talked about it, is finding the balance between happiness within and happiness without, internal factors and external factors, neither being too absorbed with one or the other, but having that kind of yin-yang imbalance relationship between the two.
Great.
Okay, so that's the microcosm there of that particular division and that beautiful paradoxical relationship between self-improvement and authenticity. And just right away, you see how easy it is to see the through line through the whole book. Again, great book. Okay, in chapter 3, we encounter interesting ideas about gossip, such as that gossip may be one of the reasons our heads are so big, and that it might be that, quote, language evolved because it enabled gossip, end quote. Haidt studied gossip and found that it is overwhelmingly critical, but that it also extends our moral emotional toolkit. Jonathan Haidt thinks that, quote, gossip is a policeman and a teacher. Without it, there would be chaos and ignorance, end quote. Jonathan Haidt, much like Joel, seems to really admire the merits of gossip. Joel, I would like you to get on your soapbox for a second and tell me.
Don't even put me in this
me about
we're the
merits,
minority.
Tell me about the merits. I'm the minority here. You and Jonathan Haidt are on that side of the table preaching the gospel of gossip. And I want you to, Joel, tell us about the goodness and benefit of gossip to your perspective.
Now, I will say I think the word gossip in modern parlance has come to mean talking bad about someone and even potentially creating lies about that person to be scandalous or to be delicious to talk about. But that's not the way I use the word gossip, and that's not the way I mean the word gossip. And in this case, what I wish to convey as my definition of gossip as I talk about it is you are discussing and disseminating a discourse about social activities and people to have agreements on morality, ethics, activity, and redefining and better defining who you are, what you do, and how you can respond in situations.
By doing case studies of people's behavior.
Exactly.
And deconstructing them together with people.
Correct. In that deconstruction, in all of this, I'm looking at only the healthy version. We have plenty of unhealthy versions that people engage in, as I talked about, making up lies or being scandalous for no reason, or bringing it up in a way that's only to discuss people in a bad way rather than disseminating actions and courses of actions for the future.
My initial knee-jerk reaction to this section here on gossip was more negative, and I can follow Jonathan Haidt's argument here, and he has a good point. He has several good points here. However, it's just difficult for me to get on board with the gospel of the gossip. And my thinking gravitates a lot more to that famous Eleanor Roosevelt quote, great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, small minds discuss people. And that is much more my thinking about that. Now, this is also me making a virtue of just my own personality proclivities, because between the two of us, I'm a lot more what would be called introverted versus you are more stereotypically extroverted. So it makes a lot of sense that you see the glittering benefits of gossip more than I do. And for me, it's just less interesting and rewarding. But to Jonathan Haidt's point, gossip does act as a policeman. And very importantly, it subverts power dynamics in a culture, in a group. So if there is a top-heavy hierarchy, gossip is a way to pull against that and help have a more egalitarian spread of power and influence. Just like socialization in a chimpanzee band, the more tyrannical leaders are less long-reigned. Their reigns are less long, and it is leaders who balance the more stereotypical domineering behavior and the more pro-social behavior that seems to have more long-term stability. Same thing with groups. There's a typical division between the sexes in most earlier cultures, and if it's a patriarchal society, the women's Congress, the women's ability to gossip, and what we would call gossip, but is really just them communicating and having their own separate network of communication and influence, helps pull against that and helps be a countervailing point to that, so that it's not just a unidirectional thing for the group. It's like an additional immune system for the well-being of the group.
I love that phrase you have. It is a social immune system. It helps protect from within good and bad parts about people or groups or society.
So with these benefits, Joel, you pointed out in our current society that the word gossip has its own negative connotations. Why do you think that we have these negative connotations? Why do we find the idea or the term of gossip off-putting or polite or impolite?
I think there's been a railing against that. And why? That's a good question. I don't know. I am unsure of why we've had a railing against it or why people have deemed it a social evil to gossip.
I think for one thing, another idea that occurs to me as we're orbiting around the idea of gossip is that it feels icky to talk about someone behind their back if they're not present. There's like a discomfort, at least for me, if I am discussing something, especially if it's critical about someone and they're not around in the room to hear it. And I'm constantly thinking about, if I am talking about someone and there's something critical, like I mentally am trying to put them in the room. Like, would I be saying this if they're in the room? Am I okay with saying this if they're in the room? And that is a good mental compass to determine what is going to come out of my mouth and what I'm not going to have come out of my mouth. So for me, that's why there's kind of an ickiness to it, especially if it's something critical. And it's hard because sometimes the goofiest, most clown-like people generate so much gossip fodder, but those large personalities sometimes come with the poor ability to accept critical feedback. And so even if what you are saying is said in an innocuous way, if that person were to hear you making those critical comments, it would hurt their feelings and ruffle their feathers, even if you mean it innocuously.
It's true. I would agree with you in safe situations, because you, Leo, and me get to feel safe in almost all of our social interactions. I would say a minute counterpoint just to that is, what if you don't feel safe? What if your domestic life is an unsafe environment and you don't have the capabilities of protecting yourself? And so talking about someone or something to other people where you wouldn't say that in front of that person provides an avenue to potentially find help or find support.
Right, and that's the perfect example of the countervailing power dynamics. And it's hard to label that gossip, but I guess in a way you could technically call that gossip. But that is very important. Someone who is really absent power in a relationship or a situation or group dynamic, that is like a social immune system for them specifically to exercise communication and information sharing and analysis with someone outside of that hierarchy or someone at their level of the power hierarchy.
And we find in many stories, male and female predators, that's one of the first things that they do is they isolate communication capabilities for whoever they're trying to control, because that's the easiest way to make someone more malleable, more controllable.
It's almost like a malignant virus or bacteria in the way it systematically disarms immune functions.
Right. Going back to our wonderful model that you have created of the immunoresponse that we have.
Right. Yeah. That's the way I can think of it. He calls it a policeman, which is a great way. But for me, I'm thinking a little bit more in a biological metaphor of an immune response. It is an additional immune system for the social group.
And I think in this way, kind of summing this up and kind of getting towards where we are now with gossip in humanity, I think Haidt puts it beautifully. Gossip is both a protector and a teacher. And we should use it as that tool. And too easily we use it merely as a crutch of dopamine, a crutch of joy. In the same way we have food, right? Food is there to nourish us, but we so often in modern day over-abuse this necessity, and we end up having metabolic disorder. So just like any other good thing, gossip can be abused, and it can be used in the wrong way. Still a great tool.
And the whole reason he brings up gossip is to lay out the framework for those external sources of happiness. And if your social group has its proper social health, again, sticking with that metaphor, if it is functioning properly and is well defended and insulated, then you have a healthy, fertile ground for having good relationships, which is so critical to your happiness. For everyone, you have to have good social relationships. And so he's talking about this immune system, this policeman force, to lay that foundation. Like, you can't have a good social network if it is unhealthy, so to speak.
And for me, I would say, with my children, I'd want to engage them in the positive gossip, but engage them with as many social situations for them to play and grow and learn and communicate, because that in a nerdy way, bringing it to Dungeons and Dragons really helps them build the sense motive skill that they can apply to almost everyday life.
Right. And sensing the motive of someone else is just as important as sensing the motive for yourself. What are your own motivations for the actions you're taking? Why do you want that thing you want? And those are harder things to look at, but critical skills to have on board, especially if your goal is to balance internal and external sources of happiness and meaning.
So pulling back to Haidt's, one of his points here is that gossip itself and that communication went hand in hand with us developing our brains even further and becoming much more social and much more capable of thought and emotionality. Do you think that we as humans are going to ditch gossip? Is there a way to ditch it? Is gossip going to stay? What is the future of gossip?
Right. I think that as long as we are the hypersocial creatures that we are, that there's always going to be multiple avenues for communication and multiple interwoven and interrelated networks through which we communicate. So if gossip is just an alternative communication system, if we have the social network version of email, text message, letter, phone call, different modes, different networks, then gossip is just one other avenue through which communication diffuses out into the group. And I hate to talk and keep bringing it back to power dynamics, but it's another way in which power is shared and meted out properly, almost like a energy grid. So I don't think it's going anywhere. We might hopefully evolve our understanding so that we can have more terms besides gossip, and gossip can maybe as a term shift to meaning more of the positive thing or more of the negative thing, and we expand our vocabulary and come up with a larger lexicon of names for these various forms of communication.
Almost like gossip plus and gossip minus. If only there's another word. I mean, we have scandalous, but that's not the same thing.
Right. Yeah, careful with the plus and minus. You're sounding like Newspeak from 1984. Double plus good.
that was intentional. Okay, so I say pro gossip in the good way, down with the scandalous lying gossip that does also exist.
Sure.
Now, Leo, if you would like, I am now ready.
Now you're ready to go into Chapter 4?
To move into Chapter 4.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about Chapter 4, titled The Faults of Others. Jonathan Haidt states that, quote, the two biggest causes of evil are two that we think are good and that we try to encourage in our children: high self-esteem and moral idealism. Okay, let's talk about high self-esteem and moral idealism. Directly trying to raise a kid's self-esteem seems to encourage narcissism. An overuse of moral idealism leads to the ends justify the means thinking. And this is one of those things that follow along the idea of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. No one sets out to raise a narcissistic child or someone who leans too heavily into the ends justifies the means, but this is an important thing for us to think about. And I'm so glad that Jonathan Haidt puts it in this book in such a thought-provoking way. So Joel, what do you think about the idea that high self-esteem and moral idealism cause evil?
I absolutely agree, and I see it so strongly implemented in our Western culture right now, where every parent tells their child, you're the best, you're the greatest, you are above everyone else, you're special, the rules don't apply to you in the same way. We, in my opinion, have more of that culture than the other part of the culture, which is, hey, we need to be a part of a group. Hey, we need to be family-centric, not child-centric. There is a current bounce back and pendulum swing back towards a more healthy medium. But I think for a while, at least in the 1900s, we have had that exceptionalism develop in children because of our culture. You get to be the lucky one. You're the unique hero.
Yeah, and as we're talking about this, in my mind, the bookshelves of books we've covered so far kind of highlight and stand out. And the primary place among all of them, of course, is Denial of Death, and Ernest Becker's discussion of hero systems really stands out here. But also what stands out is Byung-Chul Han's discussion of achievement subjects and achievement society. And this is a version of having a more negative and more harmful version of a hero mythology, a hero story that you live out, this narrative that you live out. And it's easy to slip into having too much what we call self-esteem and too much moral idealism.
I agree with you. I think it does cause an evil, even though for, I would say, the majority of the 1900s, that was seen as the right thing to do or the better way to do things.
And it begs the question, why do these otherwise extremely intelligent people do this? You know, that's always an interesting question when you see the mistakes in our societies, you know, past the past century. You know that these people, like, sometimes you can fall into the bias of like, oh, we're smarter than people of the past, but we know that's just not true. We know that they are every bit as intelligent and capable and wise as we are, and if not more so, and that yet they still make, at least from our retrospective 2020 vision, silly mistakes.
Well, it's easy to make silly mistakes. It's also easy to make mistakes when you are blinded by any level of ego. And in oversimplification, a child is a extension of a person's ego. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because they're produced by you, they're a part of you, and for most people they're part of their legacy or hero system. But even one of our most recent journeys, our grandfather was describing how both of his grandfathers showed him off in a, look how great my grandson is, look how great this is. You know, this is connected to me. And so I think it's super easy because there's a lot of what we'd consider positive thought processes and moralities behind these things. It's not wrong to love your kid. It's not wrong to love your kid more than anything else in the world. That's a perfectly normal and natural thing. Sometimes we overinflate that to teach our children imperatives that become evil or wrong. And I think, at least I'm seeing a lot of backlash from the older generations above the 60 and older crowd, where we do see this kind of individualism to the extreme of they're better than everyone else.
You know, this reminds me of another book, Comfort Crisis, where, you know, the opening lines there is that, hey, we are addicted to comfort. We have a comfort addiction problem. And like you were saying, it's not wrong to immensely love your kid and your kid to be, you know, a highlight of your focus in your life. But there is a way to love someone lazily, and there is a way to love someone that honors that which is best in them and what is best for their future versions of themselves.
I agree with you. There is a way to love someone lazily. And in many ways, I think it's more important that we get to love our kids in a healthy way where we gear them up for success and gear them up to not think everything is about them, but still have enough ego to go out, be confident, and accomplish, you know, what they strive to do. Okay, anything else you have on this topic?
No, I mean, this is another one where you're like pulling me off the ride at the attraction park, because I could just keep going on this for a while. There's so much to talk about here. It relates to so many fun ideas we've talked about in the past, but just like the previous ones, I think we need to move along. And I think just because of the length of where we're at in this discussion, we will close this week's episode here, and this will, you know, just like is our norm, turn into a fun multi-parter, because there's so much to talk about, and we'll just pick it back up next week.
Thanks for listening. This, of course, has been the Deep Dive Book Club podcast with Leo and Joel.
And, of course, please reach out to us at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com. Shoot us a message on Patreon, where we are Deep Dive Book Club. On X, I don't check it that much, but Deep Dive BC. You can get to us on Instagram at Deep Dive Book Club. We're also on YouTube for your listening convenience, where we are Deep Dive Book Pod. Leave us a comment, shoot us a message, write us an essay, give us your critiques, your feedbacks, your thoughts, your feelings, whatever you want to share. And we will see you guys next week.
We will see y'all next week.